Thanks. All right, 20 minutes or 15 minutes. Here we go. So we've talked about things such as who did Jesus claim to be? Did Jesus think he was divine? Did Jesus claim to be the only way? Yes, yes. We've seen that there's verisimilitude. We've seen in the reports from archaeology and names and all this stuff like Greg just spoke of. We've seen from Dan Wallace that the manuscript testimony we have gets us back to a New Testament which is extremely pure, almost exact to what the originals would have said. But that doesn't prove that Christianity is true, does it? Anyone can claim to be the Messiah or claim even to be God or claim to be a prophet. It doesn't mean they are. So we're going to look at, is there evidence for believing that Jesus was who he claimed to be? And I think we can answer this through the resurrection of Jesus. All right, let's just talk real quickly. Why is the resurrection important? Why is Jesus' resurrection important? First of all, Jesus predicted his imminent death and subsequent resurrection. I don't have time to go into this right now. If any of you bought that big book that I wrote out there on the resurrection, I've got a whole section on that giving you the historical evidence and arguments on why Jesus predicted his imminent death and subsequent resurrection. It's also published in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. So we do have really good evidence that Jesus predicted his imminent death and subsequent resurrection. If Jesus did not rise from the dead as he predicted, that makes him a false prophet, right? And no rational person should follow him in that case. Second, the Apostle Paul, in one of the earliest pieces of New Testament literature, 1 Corinthians, said this: "For if the dead are not raised," speaking of Christians in this case, "if the dead are not raised, then Christ was not raised. If Christ was not raised, your faith is worthless, you are still in your sins, and also those who have died in Christ have perished." He also says, and later on in the same chapter, "If I fought wild beasts at Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." So, Paul's argument is this: if Christ was not raised, the dead aren't going to be raised. If the dead aren't going to be raised, the Christian life is not worth living. However, Christ was raised from the dead. Therefore, the dead will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living. That's how the apostles were arguing. So, basically, in summary, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, Jesus was a false prophet, and the Christian life is not worth living. So that's the importance of the resurrection. I can tell you, my mom died a year ago. My dad died back in August. I want to see them again someday. And I'm 53 years old. I know my time is kind of limited. I might die on the way back. Who knows? Delta and WestJet. So, I might die a couple of decades from now, but my day is coming, and it's sooner than a lot of yours. So I don't want to think that when I die, that's it, and that's the end of life. So I don't want to be a Christian because it's a crutch, but I'll tell you one thing. It is really nice. The resurrection of Jesus made a whole lot more difference to me when my parents died, because I'm looking forward to seeing them again someday. And the resurrection of Jesus guarantees it. If Jesus rose, I'm going to see them again. If he didn't rise, I don't want to think about it, All right, so the question is there historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? So let's look at some evidence. A few years ago at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, I heard the prominent historian of Jesus, John Meyer, say that whether we're studying Jesus or any other event in the past, historians it's like we're given a hand of cards. And we always wish that we had more cards. We wish the cards we had were better. But historians have to deal with the hand they've been dealt. So, what kind of hand have we been dealt when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus? Let's give that a look. I want to look at Clement of Rome and Polycarp. Those will be our first two cards. Clement of Rome is believed and probably was a disciple of the Apostle Peter. That's right, some of the apostles had disciples of their own. And Polycarp was probably a disciple of the Apostle John. We can't prove that for sure, but there is some decent evidence to suggest it. Both of the, Clement of Rome, we don't know exactly when he wrote. It was either just prior to the fall of Jerusalem, which occurred in 70, or it was between 90 and 95. In my mind, the arguments give it 50-50 each way. Polycarp probably wrote around the year 110. It may have been a little bit later, but there's good evidence to suggest he was writing shortly after his friend Ignatius was taken to Rome and probably fed to the animals. So maybe around the year 110. It's interesting to see what they say. Clement of Rome says the apostles were fully assured by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Where do you think he got that information from? Probably Peter. And then you've got Polycarp, who says the one who raised Jesus from the dead will raise us also. Where do you think he got that information from? Probably John, but it sounds like he was, as we'll look in a moment, he was probably, well, as you saw a moment ago, he's probably reading Paul's letters as well, who was one of the apostles. Now, the reason, let me go back here, the reason that we give them a jack rather than a king, in order to be a king, a king, face card, you got to be one of the apostles, who's reporting the resurrection of Jesus. Now, these guys are one removed, so why are they jacks rather than queens? Well, because, we're fairly certain, but not entirely certain, that they knew the apostles Peter and John. So I gave them jacks. Still pretty good cards. They could be better, but they're pretty good cards to have in your hand. All right, let's look at some of our other cards. So you got Mark, and we've got Luke, who also wrote the book of Acts. Now, the majority of scholars today, whether they're atheist, agnostic, Christian, liberals, Jewish, whatever, they grant what we would say the traditional authorship of Mark and Luke. So they'll say Mark got his information from Peter, the lead apostle. Now, the majority of the scholars today would say that whoever wrote Luke, and they don't necessarily say it was Luke, but they will say whoever wrote Luke Acts was a traveling companion of Paul and got his information from the apostles. I'm giving that information because Craig Keener, in his giant commentary on Acts, his introductory section is 620-some pages. Amazing. So anyway, here's what you got. These guys knew the apostles. So they're not the apostles themselves, but they got their information from Peter and the eyewitnesses. So they're pretty good witnesses. We give them queens. All right, let's look at a couple of others. You got Matthew and John. Now, I assign them a 9 and 10. Why? If they are, as church tradition gives them, the apostles Matthew and the apostle John, well, then they'd be kings, right? And they may very well be kings. But I'm just trying to be cautious here. I'm not trying to give you more than what the evidence can bear. And I got to tell you that scholars question today whether Matthew wrote it and whether John did. Some say yes, some say no. Even some evangelical scholars would say John did not write the Gospel of John. Richard Bauckham, a prominent New Testament scholar, would say no, it was a minor disciple. You've got a couple New Testament scholars. I don't know if they want to be named, so I won't name them, but would say that maybe Lazarus wrote John, and there's some pretty good arguments for it, actually. And then some would say Matthew did. Some would say Matthew wrote an original gospel, but it was in Aramaic. And then later on, there were some people who knew Matthew, and they took that and they translated it into Greek, and then they grabbed Q. We talked about that earlier, and some other sources put it together. And the Gospel of Matthew that we have today includes that smaller gospel, but it's got some of the other stuff. And anyway, you've got all these different arguments. I don't know if Matthew wrote Matthew, but it probably contains some good eyewitness testimony and some information from Matthew. And John, even Dale Allison, who Greg mentioned a little bit earlier, he even says he doesn't think John wrote it, but he thinks John was behind it. Anyway, we got really good, eyewitness testimony in these two Gospels, even though we can't be absolutely certain who wrote them. So that's why I gave them a 9 or 10. Still pretty good, cards. Now, I know you guys are up here in Canada, and we've got some, shameful things that have happened down in the States. But if you remember when the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky thing was going on, and then the O.J. Simpson thing, he puts the glove on, if it doesn't fit, you got to quit, that kind of stuff. Well, anybody remember that? I don't know if you pay attention to stuff going down there, but all right, many of you remember that. Well, that was in January 1998, January 1995. If you remember those events, then think about the time from when that happened to today. And that's the same time period as we're looking at between when Jesus died by crucifixion and when Paul wrote his first letters. And so we've got Paul. I gave him an ace, and here's why. Not only is he our earliest of our New Testament cards that we're talking here, our earliest authors, but he was also an enemy. He was out persecuting the church. He was arresting, having the Christians beaten, imprisoned, and executed for being Christians. And then all of a sudden, Paul had an experience he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And it radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. And then Paul actually died as a Christian martyr. He was beheaded on his gospel proclamation. So it's pretty cool stuff. We've got a guy here who claims to be an eyewitness to the risen Jesus. He actually saw him. He's our earliest of all these writers that I've mentioned right here. And there's also some really cool stuff. By the way, I know some of you are thinking, yeah, but it'd really be cool. Maybe he ought to be a king, because an ace has to be for someone who was a non-Christian, who was still a non-Christian when they wrote that Jesus was raised from the dead. Would we really want that? I mean, think about that. If we had a person who said, yep, Jesus raised from the dead, I saw him, and I am not a Christian, we would think that person's a moron. And we would not want to trust anything they said. And besides, if we had something like that, they'd be saying, that's a Christian interpolation. Some Christian forged that. So really, this is really good stuff that we have here. But let me give you some more reasons why Paul's good. The 13 letters in our New Testament attributed to Paul, there are 7 of them that are beyond dispute, all right? And that every scholar admits Paul wrote them. And then there are a couple others, like 2 Thessalonians and Colossians, that more than 50% say that he wrote those, so that brings it to 9. And then there are some others that are, somewhat questioned. And then there are like 3 that are like, a lot of them really question those. Galatians is one of those that nobody questions. Everybody says Paul wrote Galatians. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul says he went up to Jerusalem 14 years after his conversion, and he met with the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John. How'd you like to be in a room with those 3? Peter, James, John, and then add Paul, the Fab Four. And he says, I went up to them because I wanted to run the gospel message past them to make sure I was preaching the same thing they were preaching. And notice what I have highlighted here, the gospel, the one preached among the nations, okay? So this, Paul says, I ran the gospel that I preached to the nations past them to make sure I was preaching the same thing they were preaching. And they ensured that they added nothing to what I had to say. They gave us the right hand of fellowship. In other words, fist bump, Paul. Good job, brother. Keep up the good work. So they said that he was preaching the same gospel message that they were preaching. Now maybe Paul was lying, right? We got to entertain that possibility as a historian. So that's when we come back to Polycarp here. And Polycarp said that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. He's writing this after Paul was dead. And remember, Polycarp was probably a disciple of the Apostle John. So he has no reason to lie here, and yet he confirms Paul was preaching the same thing. Clement of Rome places Paul on par with his mentor Peter, and then calls him the Blessed Paul. So there's every good reason. I could give you some more reasons, but of course I'm limited in time. There's every good reason to believe that when it came at least to the gospel message that Paul was preaching, the gospel message, that when we hear Paul on the gospel message, we are also hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. Now that's pretty cool from the vantage point of a historian. This is what we can certify. All right, now wouldn't it be great if we had something that said, Paul saying, hey, guess what? I want to lay out for you the gospel message I preach. Now that would be historical gold, wouldn't it? Guess what? We got it. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1. Now I want to remind you, brothers, of the gospel message I preached to you. And this came a couple years after Paul had gone up to Jerusalem to verify his gospel message to the Jerusalem apostles. So, skip to verse 3, and Paul says, I delivered to you what I also received. All right, here's the gospel message. It's what I delivered to you. It's what I also received. These are 2 technical terms for the imparting of oral tradition. And then he gives it to us. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. I know it's small font, but I wanted to list it for you this way because scholars look at this a number of reasons. The delivered and received is one, and there's a few other reasons, but it's oral tradition because you can see what's called parallelism here. It's long, short, long, short. Can you see it? Kind of cool, isn't it? So that suggests it's imparting oral tradition. And then Paul lists 6 post-resurrection appearances. Jesus appeared to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500 at one time. He adds most of these are still alive. Some have died. But basically saying they're still alive if you want to talk to them. To James, to all the apostles, and then Paul adds his own name to the list. And then he says, whether I or they, the other apostles, this, what I've just given to you in this oral formula, this is what we preached, and this is what you believed. And one other thing I'd point out here is that the word preached is the word kerugma there. It's kerugma there. Paul, you can't see it in English, but he changes the Greek word. When he says, I preach to you the gospel, he uses the term euangelizomai, preach. But here he uses kerugma, which in this context would mean official, formal, public proclamation. Pretty cool stuff. All pointing to oral tradition that goes way back to the Jerusalem apostles. Again, when we are hearing this, Paul had his gospel message certified by the Jerusalem apostles, and we've just seen an outline of what that gospel message is: the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, and post-resurrection appearances. And so this goes back to the Jerusalem apostles. So we can see that when we look at our hand of cards that we have for the resurrection of Jesus, there's more that we can give. I'm just giving you some minimal stuff here. This basic stuff that we have, stuff that I've given you here, is agreed upon by virtually all scholars. Okay, you're going to have a few flakes out there, people who say Jesus never existed, just like you got Holocaust deniers as well. You're never going to have 100%, all right? I'm not trying to persuade those sort of people. I'm talking about sober-minded historians. Atheists, Jewish, liberals, whatever, they all agree on these things, all right? That's a pretty good hand of cards that we've got. So they tell us two things. Well, they tell us more than two, but let me just give you those two. Number one, Jesus' disciples taught that Jesus was raised from the dead and had appeared to individuals and groups, friends and foes alike. And second, Jesus' disciples intended for us to interpret the resurrection as a historical event, because Christ has not been raised, the dead aren't raised, and the Christian life is not worth living. So what does this tell us in terms? I could go on and on about some things, and there's a number of alternative explanations, but let me deal real quickly with just three that these things that we've just looked at tell us. Number one, it's not a myth, it's not a legend that developed over time, because we can trace it back to the apostles themselves, who were saying that Jesus was raised from the dead. That's not a legend. It wasn't a myth that was invented. Second, what about deceit? Were they lying? Well, we do know from at least no less than 11 ancient sources that all of the disciples were willing to suffer, and they did suffer, and they were willing to die, and in fact some of them did die as Christian martyrs. We can show that at least, historically speaking, we got Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, died as Christian martyrs. Did some of the others? They may all have, okay? But the other reports come later. And you know, we can't verify some things, but the best historical evidence we have shows that all of them did suffer for their gospel proclamation, and no less than Peter, James, and John died as Christian martyrs. Well, liars make poor martyrs, don't they? You say, well, wait a minute, Muslim terrorists die as martyrs for their beliefs. Yes, they do, and that shows they really believe it to be true. Christians are being beheaded today for their faith. Yes, that doesn't prove that Christianity is true, or what they believe is true. It proves that they really believe it's true. But when it comes to the disciples, we got something different. They died not for what they believed was true based on the testimony of the other. Remember, they would have seen Jesus if he rose from the dead. So they died for what they knew was true or knew was false. Big difference, right? Liars make poor martyrs. So we can establish that the disciples of Jesus not only were proclaiming that he had risen from the dead and appeared to them, we can show that they also believed it. One more thing. Hallucinations. This is the most popular naturalistic explanation that's posited by skeptics today. You know, they saw Jesus, they saw him crucified, and he died, and it's like, oh, gosh, we're supposed to reign with him, and now we don't know what we're going to do. And so, you know, what do people do when they're depressed and confused? They turn to the bottle, and, you know, there were hallucinogenic drugs. You know, maybe there was another reason, Greg, that they called Jesus the Most High God. You know? So, they had hallucinations. Let me just give you some things real quick, because I got like a minute and a half left. Over the last 150, 200 years, they've done multiple studies on hallucinations. The group most likely to experience a hallucination are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. 50% of them experience hallucinations, but only 7% of this group experience visual hallucinations. Yet, all of the disciples, and more than 500 in the 12, experienced visual hallucinations. Would have had to have. He appeared to them, right? So the percentage of the recipients is too high. Moreover, we know from modern psychology that group hallucinations are extremely rare, if not impossible, because hallucinations are like private occurrence events in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality. They're like dreams. I can't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Hawaii. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. Can't do that, right? So you can't have group hallucinations. And finally, Paul was not in a state of grief. He was glad Jesus was dead. He was trying to destroy the church. Jesus would have been the last person in the world Paul would have expected or wanted to see. So the hallucination hypothesis does not work, historically speaking, when it comes to this. The resurrection hypothesis is by far the very best explanation. So I hope that helps you. I think it's just cool that Jesus rose from the dead, and we've got the evidence to show it, that with reasonable historical certainty. God bless you all.